Welcome to All the F Words,
a podcast where two writer friends, nearly 30 years apart, explore everything we give an F about. I'm Gabby Moskowitz.
And I'm Joanne Green. On each episode of All the F Words, we'll focus on a theme, starting with the letter F. Things like farce, feuding, forgiveness, and fear.
We'll share stories from our lives and our distinct generational perspectives, and look to the experts for insights and ideas.
Today we'll be talking about one of my favorite F words, family. Our own families, both of origin and the ones we have now, plus the American family structure of past, present, maybe even future.
People like to talk about the good old days when conventions ruled and mothers stayed home and couples rarely divorced. But in my research for this episode, I learned that it's all a lot more complicated than it might seem.
In my lifetime, Gabby, I have absolutely witnessed a shift in what is considered a, quote, normal family.
Honestly, so have I. So I think we should start there. When I started researching this episode, I just sort of looked at a lot of different sources, including Pew Family Research, which, is a great place to look at any sort of statistics having to do with American life and culture. And in the midst of doing this research, I also started reading a book called Fair Play. Have you heard of this book, Fair Play by Eve Rodsky?
I have not.
It's all about the division of labor mostly in American family homes. And it's specifically written, I think it's a book that could be used for any sort of couple, and it's designed to support family or, any sort of two-partner family. It feels definitely like it's written for a husband and wife duo, typically where the woman has the greater workload in terms of the family life. And it was interesting reading these statistics, which we're going to get to in just a minute, and thinking about the shift that this author, Eve Rodsky, talks about needing to happen in the way that men and women, and particularly when in couples with children, divide the workload. So we're going to get to that a little bit later in the episode, but it'll probably come up as we're talking. Let's start with what our respective upbringings were like. Can you tell me, what was your family structure? Were your parents married? Did your mother work? How many kids? Tell me about that.
I'm the youngest of three and the oops baby. My mom had a 13-year-old and an 8-year-old and then discovered that she was pregnant. My mother and father were married for 40-something years, and neither were ever married to anyone else. Very traditional in that way. My dad worked. My mom was primarily a stay-at-home mom, but she was the bookkeeper for my dad's business. So in effect, she worked from home part-time, but was home every day when any of us got home from school. So mother, father, sister, brother, pretty darn standard.
Yeah,
and
it sounds like
I came of age, as you know, during a time of women's liberation and a time where girls, women for sure, but then as the boulder rolled down the hill, not just women but girls began saying, "Hey, wait a minute, I don't necessarily want to have all of my days taken up with the activity of supporting a home, managing a home, cooking, cleaning, making the appointments for everyone, making sure everyone's where they need to be. I want something else." And so I looked at the choices that I saw my mother had made. And actually, let me even throw in a parenthetical here, which is that once I was older, my mom wanted to go back to work, and my dad wasn't comfortable with that. He wasn't comfortable with it both because he thought it would be a statement that he couldn't support his family. His wife had to work, which was really something that we don't see any longer today, I think. I would like to think. The other reason was that my dad worked from very early in the morning, like 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning till, I don't know, 1:30 or something. And so he was home in the afternoons, but exhausted and napping, and he didn't want to be in charge of me. So,
right.
And I was something to be in charge of, let's just say.
And you were how old at this time?
I'm thinking that was high school. Maybe 8th grade, 7th, 8th grade, something, and up into high school. So I think my mom was itching to get out there and work. I think if she were a person of a different era, she absolutely would have had a career. She was career focused. Neither of my parents had the opportunity to get any higher education because of the Depression. And they had to go to work to support their families, help support their families right out of high school. And my mom had been a bookkeeper and had enjoyed working up until she got married and had a child. And those were the end of her job days out in the world. So I grew up envying my friends whose mothers worked, both because there was more freedom, right? If your mother wasn't there breathing down your neck, watching your every move, that was appealing. But also because I wanted to have role models, because I didn't want to be a housewife.
It's so interesting when I think about my experience to hear that. Well, I'll get to it in a minute, but I had such jealousy of my friends who had stay-at-home moms who, I had, of course, in my head, this whole fantasy of, it was a combination of things I wanted my mom to do differently. My mom was both a big health food shopper. So I remember going to a neighborhood boy's house, and his mom made us like slices of Wonder Bread with Skippy peanut butter, and it tasted like cake with frosting. Like the bread that we had at home was let's call it hearty, and the Adam's natural peanut butter very much separated. I think we kept it in the fridge, but it was always kind of like chunky, but not because it was chunky peanut butter. It was the separation of the oil and the peanut solids. It was different than what my down the street neighbor with a stay-at-home mom who bought supermarket bread and peanut butter got to have. And it all fed into this fantasy that I had of what it would be like having a stay-at-home mom. My mom, now in retrospect, my mom is a total badass who, my parents also were married and still are. My mother got a PhD and worked full time while raising my brother and me. And my dad is an attorney and worked really long hours. And my mom did pretty much all of the domestic mom stuff, and then went to work and then, and all of the internships and things she had to do as part of her PhD program, wrote a dissertation at night, and went to graduate school we lived in Santa Rosa in Sonoma County, and then she went to graduate school in San Francisco. So she is also making this crazy commute multiple times a week. I mean, it's absolutely crazy what she got done. But I was very focused as a child on the peanut butter sandwiches that I can.
Well, so here's the thing. In your mind, there was a correlation between health food and working, which is so interesting. That someone who was a stay-at-home mom would actually, in fact, buy fast food or easier foods or more commercially successful foods, which, of course, one has nothing to do with the other. And if anything, one would think it would be the reverse, that a woman who was working and going to school and writing a dissertation and commuting and running everything at home would be serving the equivalent of what in my generation were TV dinners. My mom, a stay-at-home mom, frowned on that. She would never buy that because that was for people who didn't have time to cook. I mean, I remember there was a place that opened in Coolidge Corner, which was the little commercial area in the town of Brookline where I lived, and it was called Pick-a-Chick, and they had rotisserie chickens in the window, and it would smell so good when you walked by. And my mom would scoff at that because who can't cook their own chicken? Why would you need to buy a chicken cooked by somebody else? And I remember thinking, boy, how about women who work? How about women who don't get home until 5:30? And wouldn't it be great to have a chicken already made for like what, another $1 or $2? So there was already discord in my family with me looking at the way my mom judged other people. I had aunts, my dad's sisters, worked full time, all of them. And they also took vacations. And my mom said, I don't need vacations. And I remember thinking, yeah, you should need a vacation, right? I want a life where I'm working and engaged and have I want it all. I want the home life. I want the work life, and I want the vacations. And I want to be able to get a rotisserie chicken and not be judged for it.
Well, it's an interesting segue into the way that things have changed because, and it stemmed in part from a lot of women starting to say, hold on a second, this idea of having it all. I don't know exactly what I want, but I'm not sure what I want is the societal norm that's been the case for a long time. So what this looks like in terms of like countrywide changes is that 2-parent households are on the decline as divorce, remarriage, and cohabitation or recohabitation, repartnering are on the rise. Also, families are smaller now, both due to the growth of single-parent households and also the drop in fertility, which we'll get to in a minute. So we're going to go back to the early 1960s. Babies typically arrived within a marriage, whereas today, and I was surprised by this number, but I guess I shouldn't be, 4 in 10 births occur to women who are single or in a non-marital partner. So already, birth within the context of a marriage is on the decline.
It is more common. I just want to say 2 quick things before you go on. One is that when we talk about the more normative family of old, we are talking about the middle class, which was much bigger back in those days because people with the lowest incomes never had the luxury of a stay-at-home mom. Everyone had to work in order to just take care of the basics. So that is worth mentioning. The other thing I would suggest or maybe even assume is that another reason that the number of children per family is going down is the unbelievable high cost of having children these days and educating children.
Well, there are a few factors. And in fact, maybe I'll just jump to that since we're talking about it. It has a lot to do with changes in fertility, which has a lot to do. So fertility in the U.S. has been on the decline since the end of post-World War II, which was the baby boom, of which you are, of course, a product. And so the trend towards smaller families actually started around then. In the mid-1970s, 40% of mothers who had reached the end of their childbearing years had given birth to 4 or more children. But now a similar share, 41% of mothers at the end of their childbearing year has only 2 children, and only 14% of mothers have 4 or more children. So the size of families has been shifting down for a while.
I'm wondering if that has to do with the availability of birth control and many more options for birth control, and also perhaps shifts in religious observance in the country. Because what I remember growing up is the families with 7, 8, 9, 10 children were almost to a family Catholic in the community in which I grew up. I know that amongst Orthodox Jews, same thing. You'll see large numbers of children in a family when people believe that they're supposed to let nature take its course or let God dictate how many children they have. But as people have become less religious and the availability of birth control has become wider and greater and choices, not to mention legalized abortion, but let's not even go there. That may have made a difference in the number of children that are being born per family.
So I didn't see anything about religion in the Pew report, but I think you're probably absolutely right. There was a lot about the availability of birth control, not only the fact that it was widespread, but also the different kinds. But one of the main things is that across ethnicities, mothers are trending older when they have their first child. In white families, the tendency, according to the research, is that the average age a woman is when she has her first child is 27 versus 21 in 1970. And in Black and Hispanic families, the age is a bit younger. It's 24. But of course, that's the average across the country. And of course, we do tend to see on coastal cities and major cities across all ethnicities, ages tend to be higher when women are having their first child. And that has to do with the fact that all mothers are tending to be better educated than they were in the past. In 1960, only 18% of mothers with infants at home had any college experience. And today, it's 67% of mothers with small children have at least some college experience.
Did the findings suggest that people are postponing childbirth due to the fact that they're in school and studying? Or was it more that once they had an education, they wanted to establish themselves in a career before embarking on motherhood?
I think it's sort of one in the same. I think that it didn't say specifically one or the other, but my hunch is that when you think about going to college, I think that the understanding of what a woman's future looks like has really changed. The collective understanding of what your future looks like has really changed between now and the 60s and 70s, which is the research they're comparing this to. Because now when you envision a life where you go to college, that includes the career that you're going to use generally, it includes the career you're going to use that degree to pursue. And so that is the average age in 1970 was 21 of a mother having her first child. That's already pushed a lot back if you're counting college that you're going to finish when you're, if you do everything quote unquote on time at age 22, followed by a first job, maybe grad school, et cetera. I think in general, as a culture, we're imagining adulthood starting a lot later. It's interesting to look at the way these things have changed. Go ahead.
When my sister, who was 8 years older than me, she graduated high school in 1963 and graduated college in 1968. And there was a big joke that everyone talked about that girls, we were called still, went to college to get their MRS degree. You went to college to meet an educated, eligible young man, right? My mom was a little ahead of her time, and she absolutely told us that was not the goal. The goal was for us to build a career so that we would always be able to support ourselves. Yes, of course, she hoped that we would fall in love and meet somebody wonderful and start a family, but our education was absolutely for education's sake. We were to educate ourselves, and we were to prepare to be independent, self-supporting women. And she was, in her 40s when I was, she was 40 when I was born. So she was already well into her 50s at this point when she was giving my sister this advice. My sister, who majored in math economics and whose first job out of college was predicting trends for the telephone company on big mainframe computers.
Oh, wow. Speaking of self-sufficiency, we'll be back right after this message.
I think the other thing I wanted to say is not only with education, higher education, does the age of motherhood go up, but did you see in any of these findings that there was a correlation between wealth and the age at which women first become moms? I ask this because I know that my daughter-in-law, who is 36 and has a 3.5-year-old, said she is among the younger parents at the preschool, and that there are parents or moms well into their 40s and in some cases in their late 40s whose children are in preschool. And, this is a preschool that you could only afford to send your child to if you had some degree of affluence.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't see anything about that in this specific research piece that I read, but I know that it's true. And I know that from personal experience as a 40-year-old mother of a 4-year-old and a 16-month-old. I knew the exact number of weeks that my older child was at any given time until she was like 3. And I could barely even keep track of how pregnant I was with my second child. So I guess that's.
Do you remember her name?
But
it's sometimes you even forget their name, that second child.
I just start shouting out names of people who live in this house, and eventually the right person comes into the room. So I remember as a first-time mom, I was very much at all of the mom group and mother-to-be groups and classes that I took. I would say it was a very average age, and I was 35 for most of my first pregnancy, and then 36 when she was born. I had just turned 36. And now with having a child in preschool, I also would say I'm average to young. There are a few parents I can think of who are younger than I am. And I am technically, for both of my pregnancies, I don't know if we've talked about this on this show before, but it was considered a geriatric pregnancy.
Clearly a man named it that, don't you think?
I know.
A geriatric pregnancy.
Yeah, it's true. So
over
gross.
What, 35?
But yeah, geriatric.
Is that over 35?
35 and older. That's a geriatric pregnancy. Yeah. So FYI, folks, it's geriatric. I mean, in our fertility episode, we talked about how not that much actually changes in the leap from 30 to 35 in terms of fertility, but still, that's what they call it. But there are certainly no parents at least in our social group and in the preschool that my daughter went to, no parents in our cohort who were more than 2 or 3 years younger than I am. And in fact, I have very few friends who had kids in their 20s at all. And almost all of my friends started having kids in their 30s. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that we live in an incredibly expensive area, and you have to work for a really long time or come from, generational wealth in order to be able to afford it. It's true across the entire country that everything is more expensive, and it's increasingly more and more challenging to raise children. Another part of that, and I will link an article by David Brooks about multi-generational families and how that structure has changed. The David Brooks article from The Atlantic about how families used to gather around grandparents, and now that doesn't really happen to the same extent. And grandparents, those of us who are fortunate enough to live near grandparents, like I'm so lucky to live near my parents who, my mother is watching my children right now so that we can record this episode. while we are so fortunate to have that as an option, it is less and less common. Families are more and more spread out. So a lot of issues.
So two things I want to say. One is we're living longer. So I think part of the ability of women to be able to say, I'm going to put off child rearing or childbearing is that our lifespan is significantly longer. So, what do they say? 60 is the new 40, 40 is the new, 25, that sort of thing. So that's number one is life longer. And what you say about extended families is so absolutely true. The world has become smaller and smaller. A generation or two ago, you were raised in the Midwest. You stayed in the Midwest. It didn't occur to you to up and move to a completely different part of the country. Why would you do that? You have no support system there. But now the world has just gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. We can work from anywhere. We can go anywhere. And, people tend to go where the jobs are. And now I guess we're into yet a whole new era where you don't even need to be in the city where your job is located. My daughter-in-law, who, interesting, I've mentioned her a couple times in this episode, just lives in LA and just took a job with a company here in the Bay Area. And she doesn't ever have to go, or just a couple times a year she'll go and visit. But she and many of the other employees work remotely, and that's just how things work. But it is very tricky when you don't have those sort of concentric family circles to rely upon. And that has really changed. So families really rely on themselves, and friends make up a much bigger piece of the puzzle than family members did in the past.
Right. Well, when we were first talking about doing this episode, we were going back and forth about whether we wanted to do it on family or whether we wanted to do it on a word that I don't think I had really heard from anyone besides you, but framily, which is the combination of friends and family, and the way that you kind of make your own family. And that is something that, it's a concept that I think I first became aware of in hearing from people who didn't have the same ties with their family that I do, that you do with their actual families of origin. People who, maybe were, had stopped being able to be in relationship with their families for whatever reason, and so made their own families. But the more I've thought about it, the more I've realized that it's something that even with a wonderful, involved family of origin, I too have created my own family. I have multiple very close friends who are absolutely aunties and uncles to my kids, and I feel a sibling-like relationship to. So that is definitely an important part of the picture.
When I was growing up, we saw my grandparents every weekend. And it wasn't just us. My grandparents had 4 children. 3 of them lived in a 3-block area. So we would get together. The adults would all get together and do things. The kids would all be thrown together. I mean, it was just way of life. And I think that I would even go so far as to say maybe this still goes on in ethnic communities more than in sort of the white population, or I don't know what the politically correct way to say that is, non-ethnic. You know what I'm saying? Where there's more matriarchal cultures and things are revolving more around the family. That is where people get their primary support. That is where the sharing is going on.
Yeah, people who come from cultures, whatever it is, where uniting around multiple generations is important, whatever ethnicity they are. There are a lot of us for whom that's not the case. So I think that's the distinction that you're making. That makes sense.
Right.
Go ahead.
I find that I want to see my family members of the next generation, and I'm not just talking about my children, but also nieces and nephews and their children, more than they all want to see me. And I think that is a generational thing. I grew up around family all the time, and that to me seems like the norm. Even though I'm very social, very involved in my community, have more friends than I can see as often as I would like, but my number one priority is always to be with family. And I think I look at my son who has a wife and 2 kids, and he really sees them as his family. Now, obviously, he's close with me and he's close with his brother, and my daughter-in-law is close with her dad and her brother, but there's just a difference in the way we look at it generationally. What do you think? As a member of their generation, what do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I very much feel both poles that you're talking about. We live not far. My husband's parents live in Wisconsin, and we haven't been able to see them in a long, long time because of COVID and kids who haven't been vaccinated yet and a variety of reasons. My parents live in Sonoma County, not far at all from here. We see my mom at least a couple of times a week. And I am so close with my parents and very much feel like a part of the Moskowitz family that I grew up in. But I also do find myself, I think that the tension between the ways that my respective identities haven't been totally merged yet is definitely present, because I also feel this desire to start to identify as a member of the family, of my husband and children family, the family that we are making here in Novato. And I feel the tension, and I would imagine that it is more and more challenging when you live further away. I would imagine that my husband's parents feel that tension more because we aren't able to go over to their house on a Sunday. And frankly, going to my parents' house on a Sunday isn't easy either, because when you have little kids, everything is complicated. But we have one thing that has changed, and one thing that the Pew research article, and I read a lot of other articles, but that was the one that really seems to summarize the current state of affairs in America. One thing that's true is that this identity of a single family home, despite the housing market and how impossible it's become, this identity around single family homes, creating your family setup within one space that is separate from not only other families in your neighborhood, but from your parents. It's kind of a new thing. When you were growing up, perhaps you didn't live in one big communal house with all of your relatives, but they lived down the street.
The street. So I would stop and visit my grandmother at least one day a week. On my way home from school, I'd pop in to see her. Here's a question for you, Gabby. If your mom wasn't babysitting, if she wasn't helping you out in any way, how often do you think you'd be seeing her?
Yeah, it's tricky. I'd like to tell you that I'd see her once every weekend, but but I don't think that that's true. And I also think that there is an identity shift in, there's the United States has really leaned into this rugged individualism, and that, as we've learned, is problematic in a variety of different cultural problems that we've discussed, particularly in the last month. A lot of F words that has led to. But I also think this idea, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but when we said at the outset of this episode that this is all very complicated, it's because it's a lot to hold at once. So while I would like to tell you that in this vacuum in which my mom doesn't take care of my kids, and that'll be the case soon, because soon they're going to be in school. Soon they'll both be in school. and I won't have daytime childcare needs to the same extent. So we'll see what happens then. I'd like to tell you that I would see her, we'd have lunch every weekend or whatever it is. But the truth is, I simultaneously want to take care of my family and pursue everything that I want to do, which doesn't involve, despite how much I wish it did, doesn't involve socializing and seeing my mother. It means working and trying to get as much as I possibly can do into every single day when I'm not caring for my children. And part of that comes from this idea of having it all, that, women are expected to raise children like they don't have jobs and work like they don't have children. And we'll link whoever said that because it's a quote I think about all the time. I didn't come up with that. And this idea, but there's a very kind of new American idea that I think speaks to what you were saying about how if you lived in the Midwest, you stayed in the Midwest. But now we have this idea that you can have anything you put your mind to. If you dream it, you can have it. That's the American dream. And personally, I think that that's really cool. But I also think it comes with a lot of complications. And, some of that is this built up American idea of the American family doesn't necessarily work if everyone's off pursuing their own dreams. So it's a balance. What do you think?
We knew from the very beginning that there were going to be certain F words that couldn't possibly fit into just one episode: family, friendship, these big, big concepts. So I think let's stop here and we will do subsequent episodes focusing on some kind of particular element of family that we haven't been able to address at all today because of time constraints. Such as, for instance, sibling relationships. Now, that doesn't start with an F, but we can figure out a way to make it an F word. Familial relationships.
We can find an F word for any concept.
We sure can. Thanks so much for listening today. We hope that your family life, whatever it looks like, is wonderful and getting better by the minute. You can follow us anywhere you get your podcasts.
We're also on social media: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at allthefwordspod. And we would love to hear from you. If you ever want to email us, we are allthefwordspod@gmail.com.
Bye-bye.
Bye.